So it's my honor to introduce Dr. Jennifer Wilcox. Dr. Wilcox currently serves as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Energy in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. She's also a professor of chemical engineering and energy policy at University of Pennsylvania. And I think that all sounds impressive, but I think it's, and it is, but I think it's also important to emphasize that Jennifer is really, I think, the leading academic scholar on carbon capture and storage, and has been for a long time. She has done incredible work to understand the implications of CCUS technologies. She's the person who published the first textbook on CCS in existence. And I just can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your busy schedule to fly here from Washington, especially given everything that is going on at DOE and the incredible amount of implementation that DOE is charged with at this point after passage of the infrastructure bill and IRA, to speak with us. And I think it just really speaks to the importance that DOE sees in making sure that implementation is done right. So just join me in thanking Dr. Wilcox for coming to speak with us today.
Great, thank you so much. Make sure you can hear me okay. All right. All right. Yeah, let's go like this. All right. Is that better? Everybody can hear me okay? Yeah. Great. Thank you so much for having me here today. And yeah, I flew all the way from Washington and actually visited and stayed with my husband's aunt and uncle who are here too, and they live right in Stockton. And this is a really important issue and topic. And so I'm really happy to be here and really excited to just have this conversation, which I hope is just the first of many that we can have, not just here in this region, but there's lots of regions across the United States where this is just going to be critically important. And I'm also excited to share with you today some of the work that the Department of Energy is doing as we think about these projects, that we make sure that we do them in a way that are gold standard, not just from the technology perspective, but making sure that we have community engagement and that there's a meaningful seat for community at the table. And so part of what I want to do today is really set the stage of what I hope is going to be a really interactive day where you're going to hear from a lot of different people, thought leaders in the space of carbon management broadly, but that at the end of my presentation and ultimately throughout the day, that we hear from you what else is needed. And so the Department of Energy, and I'll go through this in my presentation today, we're investing a lot in making sure that these projects are done to the best in ways to ensure equity and justice. And as I kind of map this out today, we're going to be left with asking, what else do we need? We want to really make sure that we get these questions answered so that we can do these demonstrations in a way that bring benefits to communities. And so I wanted to start by kind of talking a little bit about the different tools. Earlier, we heard from the panel that in order to achieve our net zero goals, it's going to take a portfolio. There's not one silver bullet in order to get there. This is really a mapping that came out of the White House. And so in this administration, we have a series of climate goals. One is 50% emissions reduction by 2030. That's less than a decade away. The second is 100% clean electricity by 2035. And the third is achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. And so what that means is that we need to do deep decarbonization, avoiding emissions in every way we can, but also recognizing that there are sectors that are truly hard to decarbonize today. Net zero means that the emissions we put in the atmosphere we've got to actually take back out or just avoid them in the first place. And so we have to ask ourselves, what truly are hard to decarbonize sectors today? What don't we have technologies for, or at least that we can invest in to get there in the near term? Those include agriculture, parts of the transportation sector we heard about, committed emissions associated long-haul trucking, parts of the aviation sector, and also shipping. So these are really, truly hard to decarbonize sectors. And that's why we don't just need the tool of avoiding carbon emissions, but we need to also make sure that we can take it back out of the atmosphere. And the reason for that is to counterbalance those truly hard to decarbonize sectors. And some talk about carbon removal as being able to kind of attack legacy emissions in the atmosphere. That's not how we're going to see it today. Carbon removal, which is really taking CO2 directly out of the atmosphere. And that's hard to do because the CO2 is very dilute in the atmosphere. And so we also need to recognize that carbon removal should not be seen as a tool that allows us to continue putting emissions in the atmosphere business as usual. It's really going to be a tool to get to net zero, to counterbalance truly hard to decarbonize sectors that we don't have technologies to deploy. We can't, use renewables to avoid methane emissions from agriculture. In some cases, it's very difficult today to use renewables for the high quality heat for decarbonizing cement. So there's a lot of just really, truly difficult sectors. Today, I'm going to talk about overall carbon management, the role that it plays, what does it mean? Because carbon management is a broad term. It means the tools of taking carbon capture and retrofitting, whether it's a power plant or a cement facility, to avoid the emissions from entering the atmosphere in the first place. It's also the technologies to take CO2 out of the atmosphere from that accumulated pool in the atmosphere. So two very, very different tools. And then the third, when we separate that CO2, whether it's from a point source or the atmosphere, what do we do with it? How do we further manage it? How can we get rid of it in a way that it's not going to come back? And so that's often geologic storage or sequestration. I'm going to talk also a little bit about mineralization. And so that's more broadly carbon management, but I really want to be clear that carbon capture and capturing at a point source is different than direct air capture from the atmosphere. And so two very critically different tools. But again, as this map is showing, as the administration sets out their climate goals and a goal to achieve net zero by mid-century, and California has a goal to achieve net zero by 2045, that we need everything. We're going to need everything. And some say, well, carbon removal, CO2, direct air capture, these kinds of approaches of taking it out of the atmosphere, every dollar spent on that is a dollar not spent on renewables. But at the same time, today, we don't have this tool at scale. And if we don't invest in it today, it won't be ready in time. And so we have to invest in parallel across all of these approaches so that they will be scaled up at the rates we're requiring in order to achieve our climate goals. And so with the dollars that we're putting out the door at the Department of Energy, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about the legislation that was recently passed, but the dollars that go at the door out of Department of Energy come with strings attached. In this administration, like no administration has done before. And so one of those pieces is engagement with communities, which is why today is a priority for me to be here. But there's also 4 critical pieces to every application that's submitted for DOE funding associated with carbon management and more widely across other programs at DOE. So 4 critical pieces. One is a community and stakeholder engagement plan. And so if you're a company and you want to apply for funding through the Department of Energy to do this work, you have to have a plan that includes engagement with the community, and the community has a meaningful seat at the table. Now, you might ask the question, well, do companies know how to do this? Because they haven't really done this before. And I'm going to go down the list, and you can ask yourself, do applicants know how to do this? Who's teaching them to be able to write these plans and submit them in a way that they're robust and they're meaningful? And so we have a series 2, and I think, yes, there's a website there at the bottom of, and please take a look. But you can see we are providing resources so that applicants actually have templates and guidelines on how to actually write these plans and go through the required steps. Having a plan on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. The Justice 40 initiative. So this means really looking at and examining disadvantaged communities and ensuring that 40% of the benefits through our investments are directed to disadvantaged communities. And then finally, quality jobs. So having a work plan associated with quality jobs as well. And so each of these plans is a requirement for applicants to request and submit a proposal to the Department of Energy for this funding. And it represents 20% of the score that the proposal gets at the end. And so again, if you want to know more of the details, and I also have, for those of you that are interested, I brought some handouts with me too that have links to all of the resources that you can learn more about what we are requiring of applicants. Absolutely, these slides are going to be available too. So you'll have access to all of this. If you haven't seen this website, I thought it was interesting and it'd be good to share. This is the Clean Air Task Force. So the Clean Air Task Force is an organization, does a lot of things, but they also map out and keep track of all of the CCS projects that are active today, whether they're in development or actually operating. And so what I'm showing here are just all of the projects that are kind of, in development or operating today associated with carbon management across the United States. All of the different sectors there, you see cement projects, you see where the geologic storage interest is, power projects, processing of natural gas that's produced out of the earth and CO2 is separated, bioethanol. And so it's just an opportunity for you to learn more. And today in the United States, we have 12 commercial operating projects where we're capturing CO2 and injecting underground from a variety of these different kind of sectors. And so this isn't something that's new. It's not something that's novel. I think that often gets confused. And the reason why it's easily confused is because there's so many different sectors. And what's true is what is new is the demonstration of carbon capture at a cement plant. We haven't done that yet. What is new is the demonstration of carbon capture at a natural gas-fired power plant. We haven't done that yet. What is not new? Carbon capture demonstration on a coal-fired power plant. We have done that. What is not new is carbon capture on bioethanol. We know how to do that. And we know how to also separate CO2 from production of natural gas out of the earth. We've been doing that for decades because you can't put the gas in a pipeline without first separating the CO2 because it's corrosive, it's an acid gas. And so we actually have been doing this for a long time, but not for all the sectors that we're interested in trying to decarbonize. And not all the sectors is carbon capture a good fit for. In many cases, especially if it's in the power sector and you have a retiring plant, as that plant retires, what's best is to replace it with non-fossil energy and not have to manage the carbon in the future. But it's the committed emissions. It's the infrastructure that's providing reliable and secure energy to communities today. And that's critical. And so we're thinking about, as we think about siting projects, it's not that CCS is a blanket approach that will be mapped out everywhere. It's really going to be a strategic approach where it's essential to decarbonizing a given facility. And it's going to be thought about in a very responsible way. This is just also an example of, this is the ADM project. And so this is a carbon capture project associated with bioethanol. And this has been operating since 2013, or this actually, yeah, 2013. But the other thing I wanted to point out is that we have 3 of these kind of larger demonstrations. This is one of them that was funded through the Recovery Act through the Obama administration. And so when you add up those 3 projects that were funded in that previous infrastructure dollars, there's about 12 million tons of CO2 that's been permanently sequestered underground since 2013. And this is a bioethanol facility and operated by ADM. And what you see too is the well for CO2 injection. And this is in the Mount Simon Sandstone in Illinois, where there's a Class 6 permit. So this is saline storage of CO2. And it just gives you a little bit of an idea of what that footprint looks like. Thank you, Holly. Yeah, so Class 6 is the permitting type through the Environmental Protection Agency that is dedicated carbon storage. So a Class 6 well means that you're injecting CO2 underground and there's no oil production. So Class 2 is when you're storing CO2 underground, but it's via producing more oil. So the Class 2 permit is associated with enhanced oil recovery. Class 6 is not. It's just dedicated carbon storage. And so that's really important because in order to do these projects in a responsible way that's not associated with producing more oil, we need the Class 6 permits in order to get these wells drilled and for the CO2 to be stored underground. So recently we have legislation that's passed. This is really critical to this conversation because now there's economic incentive to move projects forward. One is the bipartisan infrastructure law. So November last year, this passed, the Department of Energy received $62 billion to be invested over 5 years to build infrastructure that will take 5 to 10 years to build out. And carbon management equities are about 12.5 billion of that invested. And I talked earlier that CO2 capture technology is not new or novel, and that often gets confused because there's a lot of different sectors. So it is new at the demonstration scale, again, for cement, natural gas. And so what the infrastructure law is going to provide ultimately is really helping for the first of a kind demonstrations. Ultimately, to make the cost transparent. And the reason why that's so important is because EPA, it's difficult to have a regulation if there's not a commercially available technology available off the shelf for industry to adopt to avoid the pollution. And so getting these demonstrations out the door and making those costs transparent now allows EPA to say, hey, look, there's a commercially available technology off the shelf so that you can avoid, that pollution, especially on the committed infrastructure. The other piece that I wanted to talk about too is the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Inflation Reduction Act has with it a federal tax credit, 45Q, and it used to be, before the IRA was passed, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, it used to be $50 per ton of CO2 coupled to dedicated storage underground. And it was bumped up to $85 per ton. And that's for point sources like the industry and the power plant sectors. And then it's $180 per ton for direct air capture. And so now, when you start to look at what the costs of doing these projects are, these bumped up tax credits are priced right. And so when you look at these projects that are funded through the infrastructure law that the Department of Energy is funding, we are trying to make these gold standard projects because the private sector now, it's going to be economic for the second and third and fourth of a kind. And it's so important that these first of a kind projects that we are supporting through the Department of Energy, we get them right. We get them right, not just from a technology perspective, but from exactly why we're here today, hearing from you. What are the concerns? Groundwater protection, air pollution. What tools do we have? The concerns grow, they're huge. So what are the tools that we have to make the data transparent, to make sure that we do everything we can in a way that minimizes risk in getting ahead of that? And so there's also a couple of other elements in the fine print that I wanted to talk about. And before, with 45Q, the federal tax credit, there, the amounts, the qualifying amounts were for very large units. And so it felt a little bit like those federal tax credits, oh, it's just to help us decarbonize these big power plants because they had very high, qualifying limits. Now the qualifying limits are quite low, and so what that means is that every facility has an opportunity. If you have facilities that are generating less CO2, well, now they have an opportunity to actually have this federal tax credit. There's also direct pay. There's direct pay. What that means is that you can actually use the federal tax credit to help with the capital expense of a project. And for project developers, you can get the direct pay for 5 years, but for nonprofit organizations, for cooperatives and municipal utilities, it's to 12 years. And so this really does help to enable smaller groups, communities, to be able to do this work. And so I talked a little bit about 12, it's really 12.5 billion that's associated with the equities of fossil energy and carbon management. And I want to talk a little bit about what that means. And so these are in the form of grants, loans, the federal tax credits that I talked about. And what we're expecting to do here by law is to invest in 6 carbon capture projects, 4 associated with the power sector, 2 associated with the industrial sector. Again, by law, 4 direct air capture hubs, hundreds of dedicated CO2 storage wells. Again, that couples to the Class 6 permit that I talked about, not Class 2. New CO2 pipelines. And so this is the infrastructure that's going to be built out as a result of the infrastructure law. And then again, the 45Q bump up in tax credits means that not the government, but the private sector now has the incentive to do more of these projects as well. So thinking about California and looking at all the CO2 emissions and the different sectors that we've been talking about, you have a lot of natural gas-fired power plants, you have bioethanol, you have cement refineries. Carbon capture is not necessarily a blanket solution for decarbonizing all these. Again, the age of the power plant is a critical piece. Is the power plant expected to persist through mid-century? Is it providing reliable energy to communities? So we have to think really responsible about where that CCS is going to go. For cement, it really does help to decarbonize pretty deeply that sector. The other thing I'm pointing out here is the rock formations that you have. And so a lot of these kinds of sandstone rocks, which allow for CO2 to be injected and trapped. A lot of these same rocks are the ones that spent millions of years producing oil and gas. And the same trapping mechanisms that trap that oil and gas are the ones that are going to be trapping the CO2 ultimately. Also, I wanted to talk about mineralization. And so with mineralization, this is different than the geologic storage in sandstones, where the pore space between the rocks are on the order of, microns, like the strand of your hair in terms of a diameter. But when we think about mineralization, this is different. This is that there's actually minerals that you have that are alkaline rich. What that means is you've got magnesium and calcium, and they can react with CO2 and they form a rock. And so there's a lot of opportunity in the state for these types of rocks to react with CO2 to form carbonates. And the nice thing about that is it forms a rock in the end. It's very difficult to reverse that. In fact, it's like 600 to 1,000 degrees C heat to get the CO2 back out of that rock. And so it's a very stable form of carbon storage when you mineralize it. And these are all the opportunities across the state for mineralization. So a lot of good geologic features in the state for doing this. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that there's a lot of mining that takes place. And that when you look at the mining industry, there's waste tailings, and oftentimes those tailing wastes have magnesium in them too. And so that waste can be used as a reactive feedstock to carbon dioxide and be another method for storing carbon. And so it's not all about injection into sandstones. There's other ways to trap carbon and to store it. Whoops. Sorry about that. Another aspect I think that's really interesting for the region is that there's a lot of geothermal in the state of California. And in some cases, that geothermal can be used, especially if it's lower quality heat, maybe not high enough for power generation, but it's high enough to do the regeneration of what it takes for direct air capture. And so we've actually funded 4 different front-end engineering design studies on really looking at what would it take to couple direct air capture with geothermal or other carbon-free sources of energy like nuclear in order to do direct air capture. And so this is another opportunity that the state has. And this shows a little bit of where the geothermal is in this state. And again, the interesting pieces here, like in the Salton Sea, for instance, the quality of some of the working fluids in the earth may not be high enough to generate power, but it is high enough to couple and fuel direct air capture. And so it's another resource that you have that can help us to figure out the other piece of the puzzle of carbon removal or direct air capture. Wanted to talk a little bit about the mechanisms, and you're going to hear a lot more about this today, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because you have technical talks coming up. But again, when we look at these sandstones and we look at drilling a well and injecting CO2 deep underground, the first trapping is really physical, is structural trapping. And again, it's kind of similar to how oil and gas was stored for millions of years. And then ultimately what happens is the pore spaces within the rock, and those you're often drilling like a mile underground, the pore spaces have water. And at the interface, the CO2 will actually, because it's in a supercritical phase, and so the CO2 will actually dissolve into the water and then pinch off into a separate phase. And ultimately go through these different residual and solubility trapping over thousands of years. The CO2 actually will mineralize. And the work that I showed earlier of the mineralization, those timescales are within a year or 2 at the slowest. This is a traditional way to think about geologic storage of CO2, not mineralization. And that mineralization step ultimately takes thousands of years. But these are the first and initial stages of trapping. The Department of Energy storage application process is rigorous. So when we look at, if you're looking at applying to doing the work that ultimately leads to a Class 6 permit in a well for geologic storage, it's a multi-year process with lots of different steps. Phase 1 is a pre-feasibility, can take 12 to 18 months to carry out. You're lining up the partnerships, you're getting data associated with the subsurface, which oftentimes you might purchase, from the industry because they've already done a lot of that data because they were exploring for oil and gas. And then there's a second phase, which is the storage complex feasibility, which can be 18 to 24 months when you get core samples and you're trying to understand if the permeability and it is suitable for the injection of CO2, making sure that you're thinking about the monitoring equipment. And then there's still phase 3, which is the storage complex feasibility, which can take 18 to 24 months, and also a series of steps, ensuring that you can monitor the plume if it's moving in the subsurface, and what that looks like to get ahead of any risks and challenges. And each of these stages, by the way, it's no go or go decisions in terms of future funding. If a formation doesn't look suitable, then you move on. It's not suitable. So it's really important to know that this is a 4-phased process that's designed for safety ultimately. And so more resources here that I urge you to take a look at. And again, I have a handout if anybody's interested, I'm happy to share. The last topic that I want to talk about briefly is non-CO2 air pollution. And so this is something that I've been listening a lot about and recognizing that if we're putting carbon capture on, say, a cement plant, you know, we want to ask, are we persisting with the other co-pollutants like NOx, SOx, particulate matter? And it turns out that carbon dioxide, it's an acid gas. Sulfur and nitrogen oxides are stronger acid gases. And so what we're doing is investing in demonstration of what are called polishing. And so if you look at, for instance, the scrubbing that we have today, thank you to the Clean Air Act, you know, we have scrubbing technologies today, but it gets the NOx and the SOx only down to tens of ppm. And the polishing steps required for carbon capture get it down to single-digit ppm. And so part of what we are requiring applicants to do is monitoring across all of the pollutants, not just CO2, but the others as well, and making sure that there's a plan for reducing air pollution, not just CO2, but the other co-pollutants. And this is just one of the projects that we're funding through Air Liquide, who has developed this polishing technology. It's being demonstrated at the National Carbon Capture Center in Alabama. And this is just an example. And this is work that we're excited about because we know how important air pollution is. And so I'm going to end here by saying that, you know, this today meeting is an opportunity to help shape this industry. The conversations that you have today, we're listening. And this industry needs these conversations, needs to hear the concerns, wants your guidance. And the community benefits plan is one tool that we've developed, but recognizing there's other tools. And without these conversations, you know, it's just critical to figure out what those are and ensure that we have them. And so hopefully throughout the day today, you know, you can be thinking about what more is needed and just excited to have this engagement. So thank you again for having me here today.
Great, thank you very much. Again, a reminder, if you can just pass the card forward here. So if you have a question, go ahead and put it on the card. And Sarah, you can help. That would be great. This to Dr. Wilcox or Jen, if you can read them. And she will kind of quickly scan them. I know we have a couple of questions there. Again, we won't have time for all of these, of course, but yes. And Dr. Wilcox, are you here all day?
I am here all day.
Okay, so, and she will probably need a lunch buddy. So if you don't get your question answered and
this is my second book right here.
Sit down. Thank you very much. Okay, can you hand this to her? She's got a lot here. So just, I don't know, it's kind of, you pick one, right?
Well, I mean, this first one is good. This first one that I read here.
Okay.
It said, you mentioned CCS projects for coal have already been done. How successful have they been? An analysis by Dr. Jacobson at Stanford University have been more harmful than helpful. So I'll start with that one. And I, you know, this is a hot topic. And so the CCS project that has been carried out on coal is the Petronova project, you know, in Texas. And now, lots of things about that project. It's important to recognize that the carbon capture technology is one piece. And remember, then it's like, well, what do we do with the CO2? The management of that CO2 is the second piece. And so with that project, the carbon capture technology on the one unit, not facility-wide, you know, on one unit at that plant was successful. It met the budget. It was able to capture up to 90% of the CO2, which was what was the goal of the outlined in the program. But here's some of the confusion that comes with that project. Well, number one, it became uneconomic at the beginning of COVID. And so the reason why it shut down at the beginning of COVID and stopped, it wasn't because the carbon capture wasn't working. It was because of how the CO2 was managed downstream. It was coupled to enhanced oil recovery. And you might remember that at the beginning of COVID, the price of oil went negative at one point. You know, there's reasons why I think a better strategy is coupling carbon capture to dedicated storage, that has the maximum climate benefits. But EOR, when it's tied to that, oil price is volatile. And so when the price went negative, that project was no longer economic. And that's why that shut down. And the technology, though, some also will push back, and Mark Jacobson is one, will push back that, well, it increased air pollution. And it is absolutely true. It did. So I'll explain a little bit why. It's because Petronova is a large facility with multiple units that provide electricity. And so one unit was shut down, and the technology was demonstrated on the one unit so that the others could continue to supply electricity to the grid, because you needed to take time to do the construction and the retrofit. And the other thing is we're testing the technology for the first time at that scale. So you didn't, a lot of the energy that's required for carbon capture is coming from steam. But you didn't want to take the steam from that demonstration plant because that would kind of mess up the experiment, you know? And so they had a separate unit, which was a natural gas unit, that provided the steam to do the regeneration of the separation technology. Regeneration just means the way in which you heat it up so you drive the CO2 off after you capture it. And again, you transport it and put it underground. But so the key there is that I think it got a lot of pushback because we didn't do carbon capture on the natural gas. It was only on the coal unit. So it's easy to kind of look at the whole facility and say the emissions went up. But in the end, it was the first time we were demonstrating carbon capture on a power plant. So we had to just do it on the one unit. And the other thing is in the infrastructure law funding now, we'll be able to do demonstrations on natural gas, but we hadn't actually done that before. It's a little more complicated because the CO2 is more dilute than it is in a coal plant, so it's harder. Yep.
Sorry, let me. We have.
Okay, I'll flip the page. Oh. Sure. Sounds good.
All of your questions and comments, throughout the day, as well as
Great. I'm going to merge a couple questions together. Could you share your thoughts on carbon capture at refineries?
Oh, good. That
Whether
is
it makes
exactly the one I
sense?
just picked here. Yeah, that's another hot topic. So I actually, CCS is not a good idea at refineries, it turns out. And so if you, it's just not the right solution. It's not the right solution. So refineries are very complicated systems. They have many, many different units that emit CO2. If you look at the largest refinery in the United States, it's Baytown, Texas. It's an ExxonMobil refinery, has over 200 separate CO2 streams. It's not economic. It doesn't make sense to do carbon capture. If you look at a refinery, there's one unit that it makes sense to do carbon capture on. It's called a fluid catalytic cracker. And the reason why it makes sense is because the CO2 is a little more concentrated in that unit. So it's economic to do the separation. But the footprint of the refinery, it really only reduces it by a small fraction because you only just avoided the emissions from one unit out of many. And then it doesn't help us with the air pollution on all of the other units. And so before this role, I was a professor, but I was also leading the carbon removal program at the World Resources Institute. And we put out a report that actually was published last year, so I'm happy to share that. But we talked about decarbonization pathways for refineries. And I know it's easy to say, well, let's just get rid of them all. But even in the future, when we think about liquid fuels and chemicals, we depend on them so much, it turns out. And even the clothes that we wear, you know, like there's just so much around us in terms of these. And that we have an opportunity to have a refinery of the future, which could be refining biofuels, which could be, or sustainable aviation fuels, could be synthetic fuels with CO2 and clean hydrogen. So we need to figure out how to make refineries, even the one of the future, low polluting. And so there is, you know, when we think about the heat that's required, Many refineries today are already making hydrogen because they need it to crack the larger hydrocarbons. And so a better way, and hydrogen has its own set of issues, and that's probably another presentation, but a better way is using hydrogen for the heat. You still have to deal with the NOx emissions. But again, I showed you an example of polishing. Those types of investments are going to be critical to move forward because even with hydrogen, you have NOx. Even with biomass, you have pollution. And so we still have to be able to invest. But I just don't think that my view is that carbon capture is not the right tool for the refineries. Okay. So let's see. I'm trying to find a goodie here. Oh, okay. Will polluters be able to buy and sell or, okay, this one has 4 questions on it. It says, will any class 2 permits be given? If so, why? I mean, I think, California has recent legislation, no more EOR, right, for CO2. So, but in other states, I mean, California's taking the lead on this, but there'll be other states that will do EOR. But I will just say, when you look at that Clean Air Task Force map, because the 45Q tax credit is $85 for dedicated storage and $60 for EOR, many of the operators are switching away from class 2 and going with class 6, which again is why it's so important for us to be here to understand how we can do good projects, making sure that we understand what class 6 means and what these good projects mean and how we can keep the guardrails on them. Enhanced oil recovery, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And let's give a big round of applause and thank you.